This is my translation of Domenico Losurdo's Western Marxism. Preface. What is Western Marxism? The title of this work was inspired by a book from 1976, in which an English Marxist and militant communist, Trotskyist, asked Western Marxism to declare, once and for all, its total alienation and independence with respect to the caricature of the Marxism of the officially declared socialist and Marxist countries, all located in the East. He aimed in particular at the Soviet Union. There, despite the October Revolution and the lessons of Lenin, Marxism was already a distant memory. Stalin and collectivization had done away with any serious theoretical work. The People's Republic of China didn't fare much better. Considering it as an alternate model was tantamount to affirming its political heterodoxy with respect to Western Marxism. The condemnation also applied to the Western Communist parties, characterized by an absolute loyalty to the Soviet positions, and consequently de facto Eastern. This accusation does not even absolve the party that, with Gramsci and Togliatti, had always held both the affirmation of the universal value of the October Revolution with the insistence in the profound political and cultural differences between East and West, and also the necessity of developing a national path to socialism, suitable to the demands of a country firmly rooted in the West. The English philosopher was impeccable. Quote, "So long as you haven't been invited to join the leading ranks, the intellectuals, and by extension the workers, affiliated with the Communist Party of the masses, cannot permit themselves even the slightest personal opinion about decisive political issues." Gramsci has become the official ideological icon of the Italian Communist Party. It's true that they appeal to him at the slightest chance, but at the cost of manipulating and ignoring his texts. End quote. It was a complete mystery how the obtuse guardians of a horrifying cultural desert were able to captivate legions of veterans and sophisticated intellectuals. Because they exerted a hegemonic influence over Italian culture and they enjoyed a lot of prestige in the international plane. Perry Anderson was not the first in pointing out the dissociation that was taking place between Western and Eastern Marxism. The eminent French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in a text that dates back to the Cold War, observed, "Revolutionary politics, which, from the perspective of 1917, should have came about historically from liberal politics, under the pressure of grave problems of organization, defense, and efficiency, became ever more instead, in the politics of new countries, the mode of navigating from semi-colonial economies, or from civilizations that had been frozen for ages, to modern modes of production. In the precise moment that this enormous apparatus, with its rules and privileges, showed itself capable of implanting industry, or to put to work a still virgin proletariat, it weakened the position of the same proletariat as a ruling class, and it left without succession the civilizing mystery which, according to Marx, it brought with it. A year before, in Dien Bien Phu, the powerful and seasoned military of colonial France was resoundingly defeated by the popular Vietnamese movement and military, led by the Communist Party. In all of Asia, there were the echoes of the strategic anti-colonial victory achieved by the foundation of the People's Republic of China. Communism showed itself to be the driving force of anti-colonial revolutions and, once in power, of the accelerated development that was urgently needed in the semi-colonial economies. These were undeniable results and events, but the French philosopher wondered, what was going on with the communism that the Western proletariat had to build, at least in the eyes of Marx and of Western Marxism? We find here for the first time the expression Western Marxism, which notwithstanding did not contrapose itself in positive terms against Eastern communism, at least in the context of a global critique of Marx and of communism. The principal target was precisely Western Marxism. Once disillusioned of the initial hopes of a radically new society and of the withering away of the state, a conclusion imposed itself. Communism today clashes with progressivism, and progressivism could not ignore the concrete conditions of the country or region where political action was produced. Once the messianic perspective of a total regeneration of humanity was abandoned, we had to orient ourselves in each case. In places where we have to choose between hunger and the communist apparatus, the decision was made in advance in favor of the latter. And it is possible that the French philosopher would have also made that decision in advance if he had to choose between colonial subjugation and anti-colonial revolution, often led by communists. The West, on the other hand, offered a very different playing field. Was communist revolution really necessary and beneficial? And what would be its concrete results? This position suffered from many weaknesses. Determined to refute it down to the core, the French philosopher emphasized the messianic tendency present in Marx and Engels. And it didn't help that they sometimes spoke of the withering away of the state as such, and others of the withering away of the state in its current form. Nor that only the first formulation can be accused of messianism and of anarchism. Secondly, Merleau-Ponty avoided asking himself about the possible relation between the liquidation of colonialism in all its forms and the construction of a post-capitalist society. Thirdly, and most importantly, can we consider the anti-colonial struggle a problem exclusive to the East? It would be unacceptable to support the fight against colonial or neo-colonial subjugation, while at the same time acquitting those responsible for such policies. And not just for ethical reasons. The two world wars have demonstrated that colonial expansionism leads to a ruinous rivalry between empires with a global impact. The conflagration started by Hitler a few years before, with his intent on building in Eastern Europe a German colonial empire, wound up extending into the West as well as even into Germany itself. Once these critiques are exposed, we have to recognize Merleau-Ponty for being the first to identify the socio-political objectives that fuel the dissociation between both Marxisms. In the East, and in practically all countries where communists gained power, the problem that took priority for the party leaders wasn't to promote the withering away of the state, but a different ideal: how to avoid the danger of colonial and neo-colonial subjugation, and consequently, how to rescue themselves from their backwardness with regard to the more advanced industrial countries. Merleau-Ponty was very far from hostility to Eastern Marxism in favor of Western. If we want to find a precedent for Anderson's position, we have to look in a completely different direction. Before the British philosopher and the French was Max Horkheimer, who in 1942 drew attention to the turn that had taken place in the country of the October Revolution. The Soviet communists had abandoned the perspective of the suppression of the state to focus on the problem of accelerated development of the industrially backward homeland. It was an accurate observation, unfortunately formulated with a tone of contempt and condemnation. The Wehrmacht was at Moscow's door, and being indignant or lamenting the fact that Soviet leader didn't concern himself to realize the ideal of withering away of the state was grotesque. In his own way, Hitler had shared the same lamentation and indignation. The German philosopher didn't realize that the attitude he denounced was precisely what allowed the Soviet Union to elude the colonial and slavish subjugation that the Third Reich wanted to impose on them. The desperate struggle that was being waged in the East to resist the colonial war of extermination and slavery was irrelevant to the West in the eyes of a philosopher who appreciated Marx not in the program of revolutionary transformation of existence, but only in the pursuit in a remote future of the ideal of a society free from contradictions, conflicts, and by extension, without need for a state apparatus. More than a quarter century later, Horkheimer agitated again over the issue of the withering away of the state, citing this time not the authors of the Communist Manifesto, but Schopenhauer. While on the one hand he praised Marx, it is time once and for all in the West to make the Marxian doctrine one of the principal subjects of schooling. On the other hand, he expressed his consternation by the fact that, in many Eastern countries, it served as an ideology to override the advantage achieved by the West in industrial production. The Marxist doctrine celebrated in these lines had no relation to the problem of the development of productive forces that were imposed in turn, for example, in North Vietnam. Determined to defend itself against barbarian aggression, ready to resort even to chemical weapons and, notwithstanding, watched indulgently and even supported by Horkheimer. Just as in 1942, in 1968, the Utopia watched in disdain the dramatic struggles waged in the East that were not the result of subjective elections, but only from an objective situation. Although it did not use this expression, Western Marxism had turned its back on the Eastern. We are obliged to ask ourselves some questions. When did the cleavage between both Marxisms begin to manifest itself? With the arrival of Stalin's autocracy, how does Anderson hold up? And what if, on the contrary, this cleavage was delineated already on the decisive days of 1917? What if the initial fissures had surged already in the moment in which the unity appeared most solid? The foundations laid in this way by the unanimous indignation at the obscene carnage of the First World War and at the capitalist imperialist system accused of provoking it. And what if the fissures and ensuing distancing, instead of responding to the diversity of the objective situations and cultural traditions, obey in the first place the theoretical and political limits of Western Marxism, precisely the most sophisticated and most equipped in the academic field? The manifesto with which Anderson proclaimed the excellence of Western Marxism, finally liberated from the suffocating embrace of Eastern Marxism, has a long road behind it. It seemed as if for the former, a new shining life loomed on the horizon. In fact, it was the preparations for its suicide. We will examine the important chapters of political and philosophical history, chapters that are often ignored. I will try to reconstruct them to examine the possibility of a rebirth on new foundations of Western Marxism.